We continue now at the top of Daf Chesam and Aleph and Meseches Menachos. This is Menachos Daf 8a. On the previous Summit, the Gemara brought the opinion of Rebbe Lazar that when it comes to the dam of a carbon that's received in a kli, the full measure has to be received in one vessel, in one kli, in order for it to be kadosh, in order for it to be consecrated. And the Gemara asked, does Rebbe Lazar really say that? But Rebbe Lazar says by the Chavise Kohen Gadol. The Chavise Kohen Gadol was a carbon mincha brought by the Kohen Gadol every day. It was an asiris ha'efa, and half of it was brought in the morning, half of it was brought in the evening. So Rebbe Lazar says that since it is brought half in the morning, half in the evening, so it is kadosh lechatzayin. It can be consecrated in parts. You don't need to have the full measure in the vessel. And so the Gemara now continues and asks its question, Vim Isa. Now, if it is really true that by blood we say lo kiddush lechatzayin, so leilef midam, why don't we learn the chavise kohen gadol, that carbon mincha, from dam, and we should say that it's not consecrated, it's not kadosh lechatzayin, it's not consecrated in halves. And Rashi explains, Vim Isa the dam lo kiddush lechatzayin. If it's true that blood is not sanctified lechatzayin in halves, so leilif mincha midam. Why don't we learn this carbon mincha from dam, from blood? And the Gemara continues and says, v'chitem, if you're going to say Rebbe Lazar milsa mi milsa lo gamer, Rebbe Lazar in general, he doesn't learn one thing from a different thing. He's not going to learn a carbon mincha from dam. V'amar Rebbe Lazar, but Rebbe Lazar says mincha shekamsa behechol. If by a carbon mincha the kmitza, the fistful is taken in the hechol as opposed to the azara keshera, so that's kosher. Why? Shekein matzino besiluk bazichin. That's what we find by the removal of the bazichin, which again are the spoons by the lechem hapanim. That's the equivalent. The removal of the bazichin is the equivalent of the kmitza by a carbon mincha. So since we find that that is done in the heichel, so a mincha also, if the kometz is taken in the heichel, that is fine. And so we see the Rebbe Lazar is learning milsa mi milsa. And the Gemara says mincha mi mincha yalef. To learn one mincha from another mincha, these are both in the category of carbon mincha, that he can learn. But mincha midam lo yalef, he's not going to learn a carbon mincha from dam. Those are considered to be two separate categories. And Rashi explains shekamsa behechel ksher, if the kmitza was taken in the hechel, it's kosher. V'yafagav the dina ba'azara kishar karbonos, even though really the law should be that it's done in the azara like other karbonos, but again in the hechel it's fine, because we learn shekein matzino besiluk bazichin. That's what we find by the siluk bazichin. Tihi behechel, that takes place in the hechel. Alma diika kmitza behechel, we see that there is kmitza in the hechel. The siluk hainu kmitza, as we said, siluk is a version, that is a kind of kmitza, and so therefore again we learn one from the other. And the Gemara said we learn mincha from mincha, but we do not learn mincha from dam. But the Gemara continues and asks, mincha mi yalef, does Rebbe Lazar really learn one mincha from another mincha? V'atanya, but we learned in a braysa, ad shelo pirka nifras lachma, if before the lechem aponim was removed from the shulchan on Shabbos, the bread broke, so halechem pasul, then the bread is disqualified, it cannot be eaten by the kohanim. Vein makter olav es habazichin, and one cannot burn the bazichin, that is again the spoons with the levona, with the frankincense, one can no longer burn that on the mizbeach on account of that lechem. But mishapirka nifras lachma, but if after the bread was removed, that's when the bread breaks, so then halechem pasul, again the bread is disqualified. However, umakter olav es habazichin, one is allowed to burn on account of that bread, the bazichin, again the bazichin of the levona. And the Gemara continues and says, V'yomer Rebbe Lazar, and Rebbe Lazar says on this brisa, lo pirka mamish, when it says in this brisa that the bread has to be removed, it doesn't actually mean it has to be removed. Elokevan shehigia zman lefarik, once the time comes for the removal of the bread, aval pisha lo pirka, even though it was not yet actually removed from the table, kemisha pirka dami, it's as if it was removed, and so therefore as long as that time has arrived, and then after that the bread broke, still makter olav es habazichin, he's able to burn the frankincense. And so the Gemara now asks, V'amai, now why should that be the case? If we learn one mincha from another mincha, so to have a mincha shechasra kodem kamitza, that should be the same as a mincha that is lacking, that something went missing before the kamitza, because over here, again, even though the time arrived, but still before it was actually removed, something went missing, it broke, and so therefore it should be the same thing by a mincha shechasra kodem kamitza. One does not burn the kometz in such a situation. And the Gemara continues and answers, Halo kasha, this is not difficult. Mincha lo borer breira kometz didei. These are two very different scenarios. By a regular carbon mincha, the kometz is not clearly identified. Again, before the kometz is taken, if the mincha is chasra, that's going to be a problem because the kometz wasn't selected yet. Vaha borer breira kometz dida. But in this case, the bazichin are separate from the bread, and so therefore it's clear what the kometz is. And so therefore, v'kevan sheigia zman lefarik, once the time comes to remove the bread from the shulchan, keman de parka damya, it's as if if it has been removed. And that's why, again, in this particular case, even though mincha is learned from mincha, but these are different scenarios. That's why Rebbe Elazar says, lo parka mamish, as long as the zman came, as long as the time came to remove the bread, that is sufficient, again, to burn the levona. And Rashi explains, Zad shelo pirka lema'areches lechem haponim b'Shabbos, before the ma'areches lechem haponim is removed on Shabbos. And so then again, if it breaks at that point, halechem posel, then the bread is disqualified. To have a mincha shechasra kodem kmitza, that's the same as a karban mincha, that part of it went missing before the kmitza. V'yamrina lekamon, we say later on, min ha-mincha prat l'shechasra, it says min ha-mincha, if it's chaser, if it's missing, that's excluded. Uvelechem haponim gufe amar lekamon, and by the lechem haponim itself, we say later on, kodesh kadashim hishem nifrasa achas mechaloseh, that if one of its loaves breaks, kulam psulos, they're all disqualified. And Rashi continues, Mishapirka nifras lachma halechem pasel. If after it's been removed from the shulchan, then the bread breaks, so then the lechem is pasel. Afal gav delachar siluk nifras, even though it broke after the siluk, psula, it is still disqualified to have a shirayim shachasru, because that's a situation of the remainder that went missing, bein kmitza lahaktara, between the taking of the fistful and the actual burning. V'yamrina lekamon, we say later on, diafa gav demaktir and kometz alai, even though the kometz is burned in such a scenario, shirayim asurim ba'achila, but again the remainder is asur to eat. Umakter ola bazichin delo gamrinan mimincha, and again we burn the bazichin, we do not learn from mincha, as the Gemara explains. And Rashi continues, higiaz man lefarik, if the time came to remove the bread, again that's what Rebbe Elazar says, sha'avru sheishos, that means that 6 hours have passed. Kedamar beparak tam nishchat, that's what we say in Pesachim and tam nishchat, musafin b'sheish, bazichin b'sheva, musafin are in the 6th and bazichin are in the 7th hour. Kodem kmitza, before kmitza, dohadayin lo pirka, means to say that if it happens kodem kmitza, it hasn't yet been removed. That's the equivalent of not yet being removed from the shulchan umifsal, and it's disqualified. Da'amar lekamon minha mincha prat lekeshachasr mikashir. Again, as long as it's chaser, so then that's problematic. And so that was the question of the Gemara. Why does Rebbe Elazar say that it goes by the time that the bread is removed from the table? It should go by the actual removal. And so alma lo yalef mincha mi mincha. It seems that according to Rebbe Elazar, we don't learn one mincha from another mincha. And so then the Gemara said liola mincha mi mincha yalef. Really, Rebbe Elazar does learn one mincha from another. Velo dami lechem aponim l'shar menachos. But the lechem aponim is not the same as other menachos. The mincha lo bar kometz dida. The mincha, it's not clear what the kometz is. Shakol biachad. Everything is mixed together physically. Hilkach kodem kamitza lekal meimar command kam sadamya. Therefore, before the actual kamitza, one can't say it's as if the fistful was taken. Because it's lacking something. It's lacking an action that needs to be taken. Aval lechem aponim. But when it comes to the lechem aponim, bar kometz ditu, it is clear where the kometz is. The kometz is essentially separate. To koi bebazichin, it's in the spoons. Be'apei nafshe, independently. Hilkach. Therefore, mishigi azman alifro command kam sadamya. Once the time comes to remove it from the table, it's as if the kometz has already been taken. But the Gemara continues, Ela me'ata, still we can ask the following question, to have a kishirayim shechasru bein kamitza lahaktara, even if you're going to say that in the case of the lechem aponim, it's barer breira kometz dida, it's like the kometz is already selected, but still, again, if before it's actually removed from the table, it's chaser, it should be like shirayim, like the remainder of a karban mincha that is chaser, between the kamitza and the haktara, between taking the fistful and actually burning it, and there the halacha also is, dein maktir and kometz alein, that one does not burn the kometz on their account. And so again, still we have a question, why is it that we're able to burn the levona in this case? But the Gemara continues and answers to that, lav pluksaninu, that actually, it's a pluksa, it's a machlokas whether that's true, meaning by a case of shirayim shechasru ben kmitza lahaktara, there's actually a machlokas whether we burn the kometz or not. And Rebbe Elazar savar lo command Amar, Rebbe Elazar holds like the one who says shirayim shechasru ben kmitza lahaktara, if the shirayim went missing between the kmitza and the haktara, maktir kometz alei, and one in fact does burn the kometz. And the Gemara continues, Gufa, returning to what we said above, again the machlokas amoroim, chavise kohen gadol, when it comes to the chavise kohen gadol, again that's the mincha the kohen gadol brings every day. It's an asiris ha'efa, half is brought in the morning and half is brought in the evening. Rabbi Yochanan says, Eina kedusha lechatzon, it's not sanctified in halves, meaning it has to be sanctified all in one vessel, and then it's brought half in the morning, half in the evening. Rabbi Elazar says, mitoch shekerva lechatzon, since it's offered in halves, again half in the morning, half in the evening, kedusha kedusha lechatzoin, so it's also sanctified in halves. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rav Acha says, my time with Rabbi Yochanan, what's the reason of Rabbi Yochanan that he says, Eino kedusha lechatzoin? It's because Amar Kra, the pasuk says, mincha machatzisa. It says in the pasuk a mincha and half, and what that means is, Hevi mincha, bring the mincha, v'achar kach chotzeu, and then after it's sanctified, one divides it in half. And the Gemara continues, Meisvei, we have a question. This is from a Mishnah later on. Chavise kohen gadol lo hayu bos chatzoin. The Chavise kohen gadol did not come in halves. Ela mevi isaron shalim v'chotzeu. He brings a full isaron, and then he divides it. That seems to be exactly like Rabbi Yochanan. Eina kedusha lechatzoin. This is a question against Rabbi Elazar. And the Gemara continues, V'tanya, and we learned in a brayso, ilu namar mincha machatzis. If it said mincha machatzis, hayisi omer, then I would have said mevi chatzi isaron mi beiso shacharis. He brings a half isaron from his house in the morning. Umakrav, and offers that, and then chatzi isaron mi beiso arvis. Then he brings a half isaron from his house in the evening. Umakrav, and offers that. Talmud Lomer, the pasuk says machatzisa baboker. It says machatzisa baboker. It means mechza mishalem hu mevi. He brings half from the whole thing. Again, this seems to be like Rabbi Yochanan. And the Gemara says lemitzvah. This simply means a mitzvah lechatchila is to do it like Rabbi Yochanan says. Rabbi Elazar is saying that after the fact, it's still okay if it's kedusha lechatzoin. But the Gemara continues, Amar lei Rav Gavia mi beikosel Rav Ashi. Rav Gavia mi beikosel said to Rav Ashi, can you really say that all of this is just a lechatchila and it's not an absolute requirement? V'hachuka ksiv ba. But it says the word chuka. Generally, when it says chuka, that means a requirement. So we cannot answer on behalf of Rabbi Elazar that this is just a lechatchila. It's just lemitzvah. And the Gemara continues and says, Amar lei said to him, lo nitzrucha ela lohavia shalem mi beisa. When it says chuka in the pasuk that it's an absolute requirement, it's a requirement to bring the entire asiris or ephah from his house, to bring it whole. That is a requirement. But in terms of sanctifying it in the vessel, so again, that can be done half in one vessel and half in another vessel. And Rashi explains, again, on behalf of Rebbe Elazar, Ela lahavi isaron shalom beisa, when it says chuka, that's to bring the full isaron from his house. Aval inyan kiddush b'klishares. But in terms of sanctification in a klishares, imratz, if he wants, mekadesh lechatzoin, he is able to sanctify it in halves. But the Gemara continues and asks, Umiyamar Rabbi Yochanan Hachi, does Rabbi Yochanan really say this? Meaning, does Rabbi Yochanan really say that the chavisin of the Kohen Gadol, it's not able to be sanctified in halves? Vayitmar, but it was stated the following, Machlokas Amoroim, Hifresh Chatzi Isaron, if one separated a half Isaron, this is for a Karban Mincha in general, V'daito Lahosef, and he had in mind that he was going to add on to make it a full Isaron later, Rav Amar Eino Kadosh, Rav says it's not sanctified. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Kadosh, and Rabbi Yochanan says it is sanctified. It seems to be that sanctification in halves works. V'yamisa, now if it's true that he says by the chavisin that sanctification in halves does not work, so leilaf me chavisin, why doesn't he learn this case of regular karban mincha from chavisin and say that it's not kadosh? Rabbi Yochanan really should agree with Rav. V'chitayim, if you're going to say Rabbi Yochanan milsa mi milsa lo yalif, that Rabbi Yochanan doesn't learn one thing from another, these are two separate cases, can't learn one from the other. And Rashi explains v'daito lahosef, again he has in mind to add on lahashlam isaron, he wants to make it a full isaron. Like we say later on in Perak HaMenachos V'Anesachim, Dein Mincha Pechusa Me'isaron. In general, a mincha can't be less than an isaron. An asiris or ephod, the Homer Harelai Chatzi Isaron, maybe Isaron Shalim. Even if someone says that it's upon me to bring a half isaron, he has to bring a full isaron. And again, via Misa de Gabe Chavisin Eno Kaddish. If by Chavisin it's not Kaddish Lechatzoin, so the same thing should be true over here. And so the Gemara then said, maybe you'll suggest that Rabbi Yochanan doesn't learn one thing from another. But the Gemara continues and says, we do find that Rabbi Yochanan learns one thing from another. V'ha'amar Rabbi Yochanan says, Shlamim sheshachtan behechal, if a shlamim is slaughtered in the hechal as opposed to the azara, ksherin, that is kosher. T'chsiv, as it's written in the pasuk, v'shachtu pesach ol moed, it says they slaughtered at the entrance of the ol moed, which refers to the azara. Shelo yeh tafel chamer me'ikr, that what is tafel, what is secondary, should not be stricter than that which is primary. And Rashi explains, v'shachtu, again it says, v'shachtu b'shlamim ksiv, that's written by shlamim. Pesach Oil Moed, it says Pesach Oil Moed at the entrance of the Oil Moed, which means Bazar in the courtyard. V'kevan sha'azara kshera, and since the azara is kosher, kol shekain the hechel kosher, certainly the hechel should be kosher. Delote azara she tafil chamura min ikr, the azara is essentially tafil to the hechel, it's the courtyard of the hechel. It shouldn't be stricter than that which is primary. And the point is, alma yalif hechel me azara. We see that Rabbi Yochanan does learn the hechel from the azara, so he does learn milsa mi milsa. And so again, back to the question, why does doesn't he learn from the chavisin if the chavisin is not kadosh lechatzoin? So the same should be true by a general carbon mincha. And the Gemara continues and answers, even though Rabbi Yochanan does learn milsa mi milsa, but still in this particular case, by a regular carbon mincha where it's daito lahosif, where he has in mind that he's going to add on, there Rabbi Yochanan does say kadosh, because daito lahosif shani, when he has intention from the beginning that he's going to add on, that is different. Rabbi Yochanan holds that it would be kadosh in such a case. Titania, as it says in a Braisa, Maleim, it says full. The full pasuk over here is v'karbono karas kesef achas shaloshim u'meya mishkala mizrak echad kesef shivim shekel b'shekel hakodesh shneim Maleim soles belulav Hashem and lemincha. This is by the offerings of the Nesiim, and it says Maleim soles belulav Hashem and lemincha. It's talking about carbon mincha, and it uses the word Maleim in the pasuk. Ein Maleim ela shleimim. Maleim means that it has to be shleimim, it has to be whole, meaning to say it's not able to be sanctified lechatzoin, it's not able to be kadosh lechatzoin. However, v'yamar Rabbi Yossi says on that, Amosai, when is that true? That's only bisman shein daito lahosif. That's only if he doesn't have in mind to add on. Aval bisman shedaito lahosif, but if he has in mind to add on, then actually rishon kadosh, then it is kadosh little by little, and therefore that is the real distinction that Rabbi Yochanan makes. Rabbi Yochanan would say, in a situation of daito lahosif, it actually would be kadosh. And the Gemara continues now, v'Rav. Well, what about the opinion of Rav? Again, Rav said in general, by hifrish chatzi isaron, when one separates a half isaron, v'daito lahosif, he has in mind to add on by a regular karma mincha. So Rav says, eino kadosh, that it's not holy. So the question is, v'Rav b'chavisin kaman svirale. When Rav, in terms of chavisin of the Kohen Gadol, who does he hold like? Does he hold by the chavisin that it can be kadosh lechatzoin or not? And the Gemara says, Ik Rebbe Lazar. So if he holds like Rebbe Lazar, again, if he holds like Rebbe Lazar, that it is Kadosh Lechatzoin, so Leilif Mechavisin, let him learn from Chavisin. He should learn from the Chavisei Kohen Gadol that here also it's going to be Kadosh Lechatzoin. V'chi Teim, and if one is going to say, Rav, Milsa, Mi Milsa Lo Yolif, the Rav holds one cannot learn one thing from another. So maybe again, Rav does hold like Rebbe Lazar by Chavisin, and Rav holds it is Kadosh Lechatzoin, but is not going to learn that that's true as well when it comes to a regular Karban Mincha, because he doesn't learn one thing from another, but that's not true. V'ho'amar Rav, but Rav said, Mincha kedusha below shemen, shekein matzinu belechem haponim. A mincha is kadosh without oil. That's what we find by the lechem haponim. We learn that from the lechem haponim. Below levona, it's also kosher without frankincense. Shekein matzinu b'minchas nesachim. That's what we find by the minchas nesachim. And below shemen u'velo levona, it's also kosher without oil and without frankincense. Shekein matzinu b'minchas chote. That's what we find by the minchas chote. It's clear from this statement of Rav that he does learn milsa mi milsa, he does learn one thing from another thing. And so the Gemara says, Al karchach Rav k'Rabbi Yochanan svirale. We have to say that Rav holds like Rabbi Yochanan. Again, we have to say that Rav holds like Rabbi Yochanan, that chavisin of the Kohen Gadol are not kadosh lechatzoin, and that's why the same is true by a regular karban mincha. Even if it's daito lahosif, it is not going to be kadosh lechatzoin. And Rashi explains, V'Rav damar b'mafresh chatzi isaron sheino kadosh. Rav, who says by one who separates a half isaron, it's not kadosh lechatzoin. Chavisin, if he holds like Rebbe Lazar by Chavisin, he should learn from Chavisin, Velikdosh, and it should be sanctified. And the Gemara says, maybe you'll say, Rav, Milsa, Mi Milsa, Lo Yolav, he doesn't learn one thing from another. Hilkach Shar Menachos Lo Amar de Lahavik Chavisin, therefore he doesn't learn other Menachos like Chavisin. The Chavisin Dinu Delikdoshu Lechatzoin, maybe it's only true by Chavisin that it's Kadosh Lechatzoin, it's sanctified in halves, Zaval Shar Mincha Lo, by other Minchas not. But he does learn one thing from another. The Gemara said, Mincha Kedusha below Shemen, a Mincha is Kadosh without oil. Im Nasan Isaron Solus B'Chlishares, if one places an Isaron of Solus in a Klishares, Aval B'Shein Sham Shemen, even though there's no oil, V'lo Yatzal Chulin, it's not going to be Chulin, it's going to be sanctified. V'Tzarech Lavi Shemen Ulahakriva, one needs to bring oil and offer it. Shekein Matzino B'Lechem Aponim, we find this by the Lechem Aponim. Shei Mincha Ve'ein Bo Shemen, that's a Mincha with no oil. Aval Levona Yeshba, there is Levona there, Kagon Bazichin, like Bazichin. And Minchas Nesachim refers to a Mincha Haboin Im Kol HaZevach, that's a Mincha that comes with a slaughtered carbon, with an animal carbon. Kedechsib B'Tamid Asiris or Eifa Solis Lemincha Belula Bashemin Ve'ein Bo Levona, over there is no Levona. Al Karchach Rabbi Yochanan Svirle Bechavisin, the Gemara then says that he holds like Rabbi Yochanan by Chavisin, the low kitcha, that it's not sanctified. Hilkach Gomar Shar Menachos Me Chavisin, therefore he learns other Menachos from Chavisin. And the Gemara continues, Gufa, returning to what we just said above, Amar Rav says, Mincha Kedusha Below Shemen, a Mincha is Kaddish without oil, Shekein Matzino Belechem Aponim, that we find by the Lechem Aponim. Below Levona, it's Kaddish without Levona, Shekein Matzino Beminchas Nesachim, we find that by the Minchas Nesachim. Below Shemen Uvelo Levona, it's also Kaddish without Shemen and without Levona. Shekein Matzino b'minchas chote, that we find by the minchas chote. And further, v'Shemen u'Levona, when it comes to Shemen and Levona, Kadshi high below high, v'high below high, this one is Kaddish without this one, and this one is Kaddish without that one. Shemen, we find that by oil, Shekein Matzino belog Shemen, that's what we find by the log Shemen shel Mitzora, the log of oil of the Mitzora. And Levona, we find by Levona also, Shekein Matzino b'Levona haba b'Bazichin, that's what we find by the Levona that comes with the Bazichin again, by the Lechem Aponim. Rabbi Chanina Amar, Rabbi Chanina says, and Rashi explains, high below high, it means to say as follows: Shemen below solas uvelo Levona. Shemen can be Kaddish without solas or Levona. Ulevona below Shemen v'solas, and Levona, that can be Kaddish without Shemen and solas. Shakein Matzino b'Bazichin shemekachin es a Levona below Shemen v'solas. We find that the Bazichin, again the spoons by the Lechem Aponim, they can sanctify the Levona, the frankincense, without oil, without flour. And Rashi continues, Vikash, if you're going to ask, Ha'asi Lechem Aponim ba'adayu, it's not true that the Levona is alone, the Lechem Aponim accompanies it. Lav Pirchi, that's not a question. Shareinu Miskadesh im haLevona b'Bazichin, it's not sanctified together with the Levona in the Bazichin, in the spoons. Umiwa, nevertheless, Eshkechon dechlisharis mekachin Levona shabesochen below Shemen v'solas. The point is that we find that a klisharis can sanctify the Levona that's within it, without Shemen, without solas, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Ches Amid Beis.